Hello everyone, good evening, welcome to the West End on this lovely evening, mild evening. It's lovely to see you, and we're just off the Strand on Savoy Street and we're going to take a walk through Covent Garden. Hello everyone, Diane, Carol Sue, hey Tish, hey Susan, hey Deborah, hey Robin. Lovely to see you. Let me show you what I look like on this lovely evening. This is me, just on Savoy Street. Behind me there's what would have been a muddy lane leading all the way down to the Thames. Now we need to imagine what it was like all those years ago. And the year we're talking about is 1663. We had gone through a period of 18 years of Puritan rule. Charles I had been beheaded by the Puritans after a pretty unfair trial. And then, 18 years later, Charles II, his son, who had been in exile in France, came back to England, and they called him the Merry Monarch. He remained merry, even though he had to deal with the Great Plague in the early 1660s, and then in 1666 he had to deal with the Great Fire of London. But he still remained pretty merry. He reopened the theatres. The first theatres, playhouses in the West End happened in this area. And we're going to walk around Covent Garden, which was known as Covent Garden in the old days. Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church in the 1530s, decided to get married again. He was married to Catherine of Aragon. She seemed a good match. They had been together many, many years, but he wanted a son. He was convinced she would not give him a son. And he said, well, I've got another lady lined up, Anne Boleyn. She will give birth to a boy. And the church said, doesn't work like that. And he said, thanks for the meeting. End call. He just clicked on a button. It was on Zoom, of course. It was during plague times, so they had to be socially distant. I'm joking, of course. It wasn't Zoom. Was on Teams, Microsoft Teams. And then he set about changing the country. 118 Saints' Days, which we did have off as holiday days every year, days off work. He took those back. The theatres were then built on the South Bank, and we're on the north side of the river. The South Bank, where the Globe is, where the Tate Modern is, where the National Theatre is, where the London Eye is. The theatres were built there, outside the jurisdiction of the Puritans. 1660, Charles II was restored to the throne, and he decided to commission two theatres in this area, Theatre Royals, as they called them. The Theatre Royal Lincoln's Inn, which is a bit further in that direction, or would have been, and then the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, where we are going to end our walk. The building in front of us, which is now a hotel, is one of the lost theatres of London, and it was called the Gaiety Theatre. There are quite a few around the West End. There was the St James's in Piccadilly. We had the Alhambra. That was in Leicester Square. The Hippodrome, which is now a casino, just off the side of Leicester Square. And the Swan Theatre, which is now underneath the site of the Tate Modern. We're going to go up Wellington Street, and we're going to eventually end up in Covent Garden, and then we're going to walk through Covent Garden, take a little circle and end up at Drury Lane, the oldest operating playhouse in the world. Just to show you, it's 8 o'clock, just gone 8 o'clock in the evening. It's quite busy, not as busy as it was an hour ago when I came into London. Most people are driving buses or cabs now. The people that are in the West End are already in the theatres. Most of the shows started at 7:30, some started at 7:45 and some started at 8. So we're going to go up Wellington Street. We're going to explain why the theatres were rebuilt in this area. We're near Waterloo Bridge, by the way. Used to be called, for a very brief period, the Strand Bridge. The first one opened in 1807. Then in the 1930s it was sinking. So the bridge in front of us was designed by Giles Gilbert Scott, opened in 1945. They also call it the Ladies' Bridge. 1945, a lot of the male population this country were fighting in the war or just coming back from the war. The bridge was built. Nearly 80% of the workforce were women. Underneath where we are, we have the Strand Underpass, and that was built to house a tramway, a subway. Trams stopped in London in 1952. We're on Wellington Street just now. We're going to take a little walk up. Named after Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, whose troops defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. That was in 1815. The reason we've just stopped here for a second, this is closed at the moment, but this is the Cellar Door pub. It's an infamous Victorian gentleman's toilet, or it was, whatever that means. Now it's a cocktail bar. I don't really know how to explain what an infamous gentleman's toilet was in the 1800s. Then we have a pub across the road, the Wellington Pub, so all named after Arthur Wellesley. One of the great Victorian pubs of London. And the theatre next to the Wellington Pub is the Lyceum. Built many, many years ago in the 1770s, it faced the Strand, the road we've just come off, and it housed exhibitions and dances. Actors, very famous actors like David Garrick would perform there. Exhibitions like Madame Tussaud or Madame Tussaud. Her first wax exhibition was here in 1802. The late 1700s, a composer, Samuel Arnold, rebuilt the theatre. Now the thing was that Charles II only commissioned 2 theatre royals, theatres for what they called legitimate performances, as in drama and comedy. There were many premises that could have musicals, what we would now call musical theatre, dancing, performing animals. But legitimate theatre only existed at the Theatre Royal Lincoln's Inn and the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. It then became a circus, then became a chapel, a concert hall, until, thankfully for the Lyceum, 1809. The Theatre Royal Drury Lane burns to the ground, and the acting company from Drury Lane move here for 3 years. Drury Lane is rebuilt in 1812. And this place goes back to events and musical entertainments. 1834 is when this building and this frontage is from. It was called the Royal Lyceum and English Opera House. In the 1840s, it presented very popular Charles Dickens adaptations. William Gillette performed in the first adaptations of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories. In the 1870s, Henry Irving started to wow audiences, and he eventually became an actor-manager. And right up there, a window just at the top left, his business manager for 20 years was a man named Bram Stoker. And Henry Irving, with his grand dramatic gestures and his penchant, his speciality in playing charming villains, was the inspiration for Count Dracula. Bram Stoker asked Irving to play him. He refused. He said there was no character journey. I suppose Dracula starts as dead and ends as dead. Not much you can do with it, really, but then Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee, and of course the great Gary Oldman, they did a lot with that character. To cut this long story short, as a playhouse, it closed in 1939. It became a ballroom, a concert venue, an exhibition space. And musicals only really began at the Lyceum again in the 1990s with Jesus Christ Superstar. And of course, The Lion King has been on here since 1999, seen by over 9 million people worldwide. An absolute phenomenon. Anyone listens to music, rock music and pop music and blues and reggae and R&B, the people who have played at the Lyceum as a concert venue include Led Zeppelin, the Ramones, Bob Marley and the Wailers, Queen, the Police, The Who. U2 played there, Pink Floyd. Prince's first London concert was there in 1981. And if you know Bob Marley and the Wailers' No Woman, No Cry, the 1975 live version, that was recorded at the Lyceum. So that single version you hear with the crowd cheering in the background, that was recorded at the Lyceum. On the chat, we have Robin enjoyed The Lion King on Broadway. It's a great show. Based on the story of Hamlet, of course. This is all the year round. It's Grays and Feathers, which is a little cocktail bar, an oyster bar. But on this site, an apartment was rented by Charles Dickens, and the magazine, All the Year Round, was published here and prepared here. There was an upturn in reading and writing, mainly reading actually, in the 1800s. When we always talk about people who could read and write, often people learned to read way before they could write. But they were still quite poor, so they needed to find a way to enhance their experience of reading when they couldn't afford a book. So magazines like All the Year Round, and in the late 1800s, of course, we had the Strand magazine, which Arthur Conan Doyle, most of his short stories were serialized in. It meant that people who had a thirst for reading could afford a magazine, and then everything was serialised. We're going up Wellington Street. The bunch of people there are outside the Coach and Horses. Some of my family run that pub, and they say to me, don't call it an Irish pub. My family are Irish, from Cork and Cavan, and they say never call this an Irish pub. It's a pub run by Irish people. There has been a pub on the site since the 1750s, and it would have been the local haunt for any theatre goer in the 1700s. Now, a great pub. The road we're on, Wellington Street, was named after Charles II. Originally, Charles Street. And then they changed it after 1815. There were two very well-known brothels on the street and a coffee house, Hanover's, at number 38. Then they changed their coffee house into a brothel. They realised they could make money selling things other than coffee. This sad looking spectacle in front of us is the Marquis of Anglesey. Built on the site of Edward Miles's coffee house in 1663, the pub has been on this site under a few names since 1752. It was known as the Barley Mow, the Green Man. Now it's known as the Marquis of Anglesey, and it's opening in about 2 weeks, so they need to get their skates on. A great pub, Kiefer Sutherland's favourite pub in London, only because he was pictured in the press shirtless, drunk outside the pub, and he was interviewed by a TV show host, and he said, right, we saw you outside this pub. He said, it's my favourite pub in London. Why wouldn't I be shirtless outside it? And now Wellington Street becomes Bow Street. And the white building right in the centre of the screen is the Bow Street Magistrates' Court. Started really in 1740 by Colonel Sir Thomas de Vale, and two brothers were the main magistrates for it. One of them was Henry Fielding, who wrote Tom Jones, and another was his brother, Sir John Fielding. And the magistrates' court, the magistrates in them were not official judges. They were respectable members of society. Henry Fielding noted in the 1740s that on this road, which is now Bow Street, every fourth house was a gin shop, and every fifth house was a brothel. And the crime that resulted from that was out of control. So he created a group of constables called Fielding's People, basically a crime-fighting team, which then became known as the Bow Street Runners. His brother, Sir John, who was blind, was known as the Blind Beak of Bow Street. And this area really started and refined what we now know, or now would call, a modern police force. Not just catching criminals, but stopping crime. Then in 1829, the Metropolitan Police started. This closed as a police station in 1992, and the court closed in 2006. It's now a boutique hotel and a police museum. But to go back to this term, magistrates' court, it's interesting. A lot of cases that were heard here, if there was a guilty plea, it wouldn't go any further. It wouldn't go to a Crown Court or a High Court. The Cray twins, famous London gangsters, and Oscar Wilde both had magistrates' hearings here. So this area, as well as a lot of the West End really, this side, more of it, away from Piccadilly, was crime-ridden. But still, it's where the theatres began. Let's come up to a statue here. Normally there's somebody sat here and we can't really stop next to the statue, but we can today. It's called The Young Dancer, sculpted by a man named Enzo Plazzotta, an Italian who spent most of his working life in London. This was erected in 1988 and it's supposed to resemble a movement in bronze. And Enzo has quite a few others all over the world, one of them in Westminster Abbey named Crucifixion, one at the Barbican, and two in the US. The Hand of Christ, which is in Worcester, Massachusetts, the Dinand Library, and Two Brothers, which is in Boys Town, Nebraska. So it's a bit of peace and quiet. Lovely little haven in busy London. Why is it here? Well, behind us we have the Royal Ballet and the Royal Opera House. Right behind us is the Royal Opera House, an epic, beautiful sight. Now obviously you can see the Corinthian columns, but the first thing I want to point out is the floral hall. Positioned in the centre of the screen. Originally built to house a flower and a fruit and veg market in Covent Garden, and originally it wasn't part of the theatre, it was part of Covent Garden Market. Bought by the Opera House in the 1970s, and then they sold it to Borough Market on the South Bank, quite near Shakespeare's Globe. And then they rebuilt it here again. Even though they sold the entire floral hall, they owned the land and they thought, well, let's build it again. The publisher Paul Hamlin donated 10 million to have it reconstructed. Very sympathetically, it's slightly larger than the original floral hall, at a donation of 10 million. So it's an entrance. It's used for events, workshops, concert recitals. And the current Royal Opera House, the building is the third on the site, after fires in 1808 and 1856. The original 1732 building was only the second playhouse in London, what we now call London anyway. The second patent license was for a man named William Davenant, who started the Duke's Company. And he owned the theatre in Lincoln's Inn, which burnt to the ground. And the license went from place to place until the fire in 1808, reopened 1809. The prices went up. It ignited something which we now know or call the old price riots. Hissing, booing, invading the stage, shopping or stopping the shows. Then it reverted back to the old prices. Then it was known as the Royal Italian Opera. And gradually, in the late 1800s, more places sprung up that were more suited to plays. The licenses were no longer needed. and it burnt down again in 1856. 1857 reopened as the Royal English Opera Company, and then in 1892 the building was renamed the Royal Opera House. It holds 2,300. The reason that bridge covers the walkway here on Floral Street, it's called the Bridge of Aspiration. And on the right hand side you have the Royal Ballet, on the left hand side the Royal Opera House. In 1775 an actor named Richard Brinsley Sheridan, also a very famous writer, had created a play called The Rivals. The problem was, it was the opening night and he hadn't finished it. So the actors in the play said, look, we're going on stage, you haven't finished the play and you need to. Here you are, here's a couple of bottles of port and a massive amount of anchovy sandwiches, your favourite. Just stay in there and try and finish the play before the intermission of this first performance. He went in and he said, yeah, I'll do my best, and they locked him in. Locked in the green room. They say that the rooms were painted green just off the side of the stage because it was a calming colour. And also some people say they were covered in green baize, like the material of a pool or a snooker or a billiard table, because they would soundproof the room. Another actor, Charles Macklin, performed there. In his 90s, he retired halfway through a show when he forgot a line. He was being seized with terror of the mind. I shall retire now so that I never find myself in so ridiculous a position again. Charles Macklin was more famous for an act he did off stage than he was for an act he did on stage. He performed at Drury Lane many years ago and he stabbed and killed another actor in the middle of a show after an argument about a wig. He was convinced the other actor had taken his prop wig, stabbed him through the eye, and his monument and his burial site is just around the corner at St. Paul's Church. Also, the Royal Opera House invented something that we now think of as a very easy phrase, the limelight. In 1837, an actor, director, manager named William Charles Macready burnt a block of calcium lime and it would shine in the actors' faces, putting them in a glow more than the other actors on stage, hence the phrase to be in the limelight. So now we're in Covent Garden. I need to point something out. I know he didn't finish the play, he never finished the play, Diane. I need to explain something. So we're having a lovely time. I think we are. And maybe you think we are as well. We're in the lovely Covent Garden where the first theatres were built. I've been an actor myself 25 years. Every now and then people use your image. It's happened where I've done a commercial and then the commercial has run for another year and your agent rings you and says, oh, you're going to get a payment because they're going to use it for another year. And I say, okay, that's great. These guys who are selling DeLonghi coffee, I mean, it's quite upsetting. But they have used my image to sell their coffee. Isn't it unbelievable what people do? Makes me sick, really. Sorry. That's a personal issue. So we were on Floral Street, near the Bridge of Aspiration. It was called Hart Street in the 1890s, but they changed it to reflect the trade, the rebranding. This is Covent Garden. This is where the market is. In the 7th century, this was all fields. The Anglo-Saxons used it for a couple of hundred years. And by the year 1200, the Westminster Abbey nuns and monks walled off this area, used it as a fruit and veg garden. Again, I'll refer you back to Henry VIII getting married and taking land from the Catholic Church. This was Catholic land, and he gave it to a friend of his named John Russell, the Earl of Bedford, in the 1530s, which is why we have two main thoroughfares running through Covent Garden, Russell Street and Bedford Street. In the early 1630s, Inigo Jones, a wonderful architect, spent a long time in Italy, designed a plaza, a piazza, a square and a church. And it was then a fruit and veg market for many years. That all stopped in the 1960s. The traffic was so bad, the market was eventually relocated to Nine Elms, which is about 3 miles from where we are, or about 5 kilometres. I don't want us to lose a signal, but I am going to walk us through here underneath the piazza. So originally this area attracted rich, wealthy people in the early 1600s. But when the market opened, between 1630 and about 1660, the wealthy moved out and moved further west towards Piccadilly, Mayfair, the King's Road, Fulham, Chelsea, towards Hampton Court. And the coffee houses, the pubs, the brothels, the animal fighting arenas, the cockpits, and then the theatres were rebuilt in this area. There was a handbook named Harris's List of Covent Garden Ladies, the essential guide and accessory for any serious gentleman of pleasure. That was the full name. I don't have a copy, and I probably won't buy one. So people were trying to make a living. It was mixing, though, theatre goers with their disposable incomes with folks who had nothing. It was always going to be tricky. This is St. Paul's Church. Where Eliza Doolittle in Pygmalion tries to sell flowers to Colonel Pickering, whilst Henry Higgins notes down everything she says. St. Paul's Church is otherwise known as the Actors' Church, opened in 1633. And this temple front, this portico, is not the main entrance. In 1662, Samuel Pepys, the diarist, saw something called an Italian puppet play from a balcony just behind the church. And the pub has been named after what he saw. It's called the Punch and Judy. On the chat, people are asking, am I here today? I am here right now, Laurie. Right here, right now. 8:37 p.m. in the West End. There's another market a little bit further up. I just want to bring our attention to the flowers that are here. First of all, you may see a few flags around. I don't know if you know, but we had a coronation recently. King Charles and Queen Camilla. You might not know this, but it's what happened. It's the old Apple market, and strangely, the Apple store is right next to us. Apple were always great at branding. Quite a few of the flowers that are growing now, the tulips are dying out. The rhododendrons are coming into full force. Laurie is asking on the chat, have I ever eaten at any of the restaurants or pubs in Covent Garden that I would recommend? Well, there's a wonderful one up here called the Ivy. The Ivy used to be one restaurant just near the St. Martin's and Ambassadors Theatre. The St. Martin's where the Mousetrap is on. But they've become not a chain as such, but they've opened about 4 or 5 in London. And I went to the original, met Angela Lansbury, which was one of the greatest moments of my acting career. But I haven't been to this one. But it's the same chefs, or the same head chef. And if you come to Covent Garden, I would suggest you go to the Ivy. The service is second to none. The food is amazing. The ambience is unbelievable. That's the Ivy for you. Or the Ivy flagship is a bit further away from here. This is the Little Sister. So it's still a market in a way. Most of it is high-end retail now, with the odd little cheaper restaurant stuck in and about. But Jubilee Market is in front of us. It opened in 1987. It was unveiled by Queen Elizabeth. And it's the only market in London to be completely owned by the traders. On Monday they have antiques. Tuesday to Thursday it's just general market. And Saturday and Sunday arts and crafts. And this lovely sculpture here, this frieze, is showing you what the market would have been like back in Eliza Doolittle's time. On the chat, if anyone is watching this as a rerun and not watching the chat, Laurie has mentioned about the idea that this could be, because it's a very busy area, it's got the Times Square feel about it, that there could be the odd tourist trap. And that's always possible. Thankfully, these days we have the internet that can give us recommendations, they can give us health warnings and so on. But there are still wonderful restaurants in London have been lifted. And then, of course, I don't want to get political, but the UK left decided to vote to leave the European Union. The prices have shot up. But then for visitors to London, it's often quite nice because the pound has gone down in value. So they might feel, oh, actually things are quite good. It's just living here is not so easy. And that's why we sneak in tours here and there. And I work many, many hours, and I appreciate any donation, any tip, any payment for any of these things, and I know that every single guide does. I just saw this little corridor here, and it's very atmospheric. If it was a bit later at night, this would be spooky. This would be a time for ghost stories, but not so much now. Still quite bright. I did, however, many years ago when I worked as a tour guide. When I first became an actor, I worked at Drury Lane. And I did a tour for the Covent Garden Traders Association. And they said that they were the market sellers here. They were the traders. They would go underneath here and store all the fruit and veg at night. So underneath us here, there are all these tunnels and storage areas. And they said that they would see rats the size of rugby balls. I mean, they had an unlimited supply of food, really. Every now and then on these tours, in that far corner, there's an opera singer serenading people for the Newmarket traders have these amazing pods. So this one is closed up, of course, but they open in many different directions. They open up and down and side to side, so that's a closed pod. This guy's still open, but he's closing up, and you can see what they can do with these small pods, what they can provide. And everything is kept securely and safely overnight. In the old days, everyone had to drag everything to the market every single day. Imagine the booksellers, the paper manufacturers, the pen makers that were going to St. Paul's churchyard, around St. Paul's Cathedral, dragging everything every day, and then realizing that the mud of the streets off the beaten path, pen makers and printers in London were allowed to have the first fixed locations in London for their premises. And it's why we use, in this country, two words which sound the same, which are spelt slightly differently. Now, if I stand still here, I am stationary. If I had a market here, a shop that didn't move, it would be a stationary shop. And if that shop sold pens and paper and ink and printing materials, it would be a stationary shop. So the first traders in London to be allowed fixed locations for their market stalls were selling paper, ink, paper and books. The stationers. It's where it all comes from. And now we're on Russell Street, and in front of us, behind the rickshaws here, I'm not advertising rickshaw the platform, but in front of us is the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. Opened in 1663, the oldest operating theatre in the world. There have been 4 buildings. It's burnt down twice, been demolished once. The first time moving scenery was ever seen in London was here. The word props, it all came from property of the theatre. They stamped everything. They didn't want people stealing anything. Fire curtains, safety curtains. London girls couldn't read and write. They didn't go to school. If you could read and write, you were aristocracy, and your parents would not promote acting as a profession. Margaret Hughes played the role of Desdemona in Othello. One of the biggest casts and crews of all time was here. In 1931, Noel Coward's show Cavalcade, a cast and crew of over 400 people. Also one of the most haunted theatres in the West End, but we will get to that another time, because next week I shall be doing haunted theatres of the West End, and I want to save those stories. Now owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Lloyd Webber Theatres, which were known as the Really Useful Group. Before that, Stoll Moss Theatres, and the old Stoll Empire. An epic theatre, dates back by name to 1663 and showing a very authentic traditional production, Frozen the musical. I'm going to show you my face and gradually say goodbye. Here I am, folks. There's my ride home. No signal, everything looks nice, it's pinging. Behind us is Russell Street. The pillars behind us used to be painted bright green. They called this road Rhubarb Alley because they were painted bright green. They look like sticks of rhubarb from a distance, painted bright red. If they painted them green, actually, they could have called it Celery Alley, but not necessarily. That's a wonderful joke there, in case you didn't realise. The rickshaws are having a great time. Some of them do have signs where they say, we can take you to Stansted Airport, which is about 60 miles from where we are. I think you might need a couple of days to get there. Lovely. People are appreciating a little bit slowly because there's always a bit of a time lapse on YouTube. The jokes. Sometimes I make a fantastic joke and it's a good minute later that people are laughing. Now, I was thinking for a while, is my joke that clever? Are they working this joke out? And no, it's just there is a time lapse. I'm going to go home. I'm going to get ready for the day tomorrow. It's now nearly 9 o'clock, not too far off. You can walk with me if you want. You can ask me questions if you want. We're going to go down a side street. It's not so easy. I know Patrick has said that. The chat is a tiny bit smaller on YouTube. And with men like me and Patrick, when we get to our age, in our late 20s, it's not so easy to see the chat. The eyes go in your late 20s. If I see anybody laughing at that, you are in major, major trouble. So we're back on Wellington Street. I'm going to take a little cut down. There's some tarpaulin with the clouds in the sky literally matching the tarpaulin. Okay, Tish. Tish laughed at the joke. And to Gary. Because it's everywhere on our tours. As I mentioned the other day, Natalie doesn't seem to have it. She obviously does non-scaffold, non-tarpaulin tours. Along this road, in the next year, maybe you can tell Dave in Dublin this, the great Dave Kavanagh, they are building a Guinness brewery and museum. And it's on this road. It will be along here. Within the next couple of years, there will be a Guinness brewery and museum here. And it will rival the one, but nowhere near match the one in Dublin. To the right of us, we're underneath the shade of the Transport Museum. We're on Burley Street. I mentioned the magazine All the Year Round, which Charles Dickens wrote for, but the Strand magazine, which Arthur Conan Doyle wrote for. Just where the tarpaulin is in the centre of the screen was the Strand magazine, where 56 of Arthur Conan Doyle's short stories were handed in for him to make that money. He kept coming back to the stories. He killed Sherlock Holmes off quite early in his writing career, and then his mother said, "How could you do that, you brute?" Basically, his mother was saying, we had a cash cow, you were making a fortune. But he always said that the Sherlock Holmes stories were keeping him from other things, better things. But he went back to them, and then he wrote even more than he had written pre-retirement. Now, I will let you go. You may see a message pinned at the top, and it shows a PayPal account. It shows a Buy Me a Coffee account. You're very welcome to click on those and send me. I'm very thankful, I'm so grateful for this, a donation or a tip. On the Buy Me a Coffee account, I've started a membership program, an unlisted tours club, I call it. And there'll be quite a few on there. A ghost story and a tour every week, which won't be on the regular YouTube site. And it will thank you for your support and also keep me going with the work. I'm not going to give up anything for people for free. That's not my style. It's just a way of maybe trying to earn a living and try and guarantee some kind of predictable income. This is Maiden Lane. Can you imagine what they sold along here over the years? Anyone from Canada? This is the Maple Leaf, the Canadian pub in London. Or a Canadian themed pub. Last night we passed the Canadian High Commission. This is the Canadian pub. The Maple Leaf. Maiden Lane, Michelle, Maiden. We're going to stop at the back of one of the theatres. There are two stage doors of theatres in this area. The theatre's on the Strand, which is down to the left. This is Lumley Court, by the way. Very spooky little road. Little lane down there, very ghostly little place. This is the back of the Vaudeville Theatre. And Voltaire, the philosopher, writer, poet, did a bit of everything, lived there. And just up here was the home for a great actor, William Terrace. William Terrace was murdered, and he was the Brad Pitt of his day. And we saw the picture of Brad Pitt earlier, advertising coffee earlier. William Terrace was a matinee idol, one of the most famous actors of his day. And he was murdered by a jealous rival, Richard Arthur Prince, at the back of here, the Adelphi Theatre, which is now showing Back to the Future. And this is the plaque that commemorates that. William Terrace, 1847 to 1897. 16th of December, he met his untimely end here. Right, good luck to you all. These are the crew, the Adelphi Theatre. I know a couple of them. I'm going to run on quickly so they don't interrupt our time together. And I will see you very, very soon. Once again, let's show you my face. Thank you so much. Lots of love to you all. I gave us a little bit of a DVD extra there. And thank you very, very much. See you very, very soon. Going to schedule a Haunted Theatres of the West End tour for next week and a few other tours, Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie and George Orwell. Maybe a few unsolved mysteries, maybe a few ghost stories from home. Lovely blue sky, a vanilla sky in the distance. Take care, lots of love. I will see you very, very soon. Thank you for all your company and everything you do.